Yay! Let's get into free speech. I haven't done that recently, and I'm totally not sitting on hours of conversation on the topic already. Well, I am. It's much harder to get motivated at hours of conversation than half an hour or less. Especially when a 10-minute video can ultimately take more than 8 hours of work. But I think this is an important topic, and I also couldn't let some of this slide.
Here lies the first point I want to make. Angus is conflating two questions, one being, is all speech protected by free speech, and the other being, whose speech should be prioritised defending, and he's acting as if we must choose to either protect the speech of those we hate, or the speech of those most under attack, when this simply isn't the case.
Actually, this can sometimes be the case. And you'll later demonstrate for me precisely how one person's speech can be at odds with another person's ability to speak, or ability to listen for that matter. However, I will grant, for now at least, that the context of the discussion you're responding to doesn't actually have this problem. That it is, in fact, possible to protect both at once.
If we say all speech is protected, which is not the same as saying that all speech carries no consequence, or that all speech can be exerted anywhere and at any time, then we get to defend our own speech, our adversaries, and those who are most under attack. And let's face it, the latter two are often the same. Or in other words, if we say free speech means free speech for all people and all ideas, then priority simply isn't a concern.
Again, I'm going to postpone putting where priority is a concern until it's demonstrated hands down for me. But I do want to take a moment to point out the distinction. You said this.
Which is not the same as saying that all speech carries no consequence, or that all speech can be exerted anywhere and at any time.
I agree that speech has consequences. I agree that the absolutist view of free speech does not apply at all places and times. It doesn't apply, for example, to forcing me to let anyone stand in my home and speak if I want them to leave. I would say that any reasonable person puts limits somewhere. The question is where and why. But an absolutist view requiring no restriction does necessarily mean that all speech is allowed wherever and whenever that is applied. If someone happens to apply the concept to everywhere and all time, then it does come out to mean that all speech is allowed in all places and times. This is the unfortunate but rational end of declaring that anything less than absolutism means someone doesn't care about free speech, a concept I seem to run into occasionally. The moment you place anything above it, even in a limited context, some of those who agree with you about it being an absolute can come out against you as someone who hates, or at least doesn't care about, free speech. Which is, of course, ridiculous. It's just a bit of ridiculous I get from time to time.
Now, as a slight side note, I want to emphasise that the reason I'm using Angus's defence of this position, which is held by a hell of a lot more people than you might think, is because it's a sophisticated rendition, a stillman, if you will.
I want to take a moment to consider just how concerning that graph actually is. While this video gets very wishy-washy and all over the place in general, that graph is actually discussing laws. That is one area we need to make our decisions very carefully. Were the entire argument actually about protecting absolute free speech in a legal sense, I would not be responding at all. I mean, there may be relatively safe ways to enact such laws and protections, but it's very dangerous ground to tread on. The possible issues can be seen in many places that have such laws, or have other legal restrictions on freedom of speech. In the sense of avoiding all, or at least damn close to all, laws prohibiting speech, I am an absolutist, or at least as incredibly close as I can imagine being.
But before we move on, I think it's necessary to give an example of what this position looks like in practice, because it ain't pretty.
I believe in open discussion.
You believe in a platform for hate, oppression, a platform for hate.
May I respond?
No, I'm not interested.
I believe in open
I don't
discussion.
care what you believe. I believe no.
You better
Stop.
you here.
We don't want you.
You're not welcome here.
I will
You
slap
like people like you are not welcome here.
Welcome.
Go away. Go away.
Excuse me.
Go
Excuse me.
away. Go away.
Excuse me.
Go away. Go away. Go away. Go away. Nazi scum off our street! Nazi scum off our street! Nazi scum off our street! Nazi scum off our street!
So here we have someone very politely defending free speech by holding a sign that reads, "The right to openly discuss ideas must be defended." And yet, because the protesters are against the speech of those they hate, he's been silenced, physically manoeuvred, and called a Nazi. Again, for saying that everyone has the right to express their thoughts. Now, needless to say, I don't like Nazis, but for me the problem here is outrageously obvious.
Okay, so here we have an example of where speech itself can clash with freedom of speech. Obviously, the physically pushing him away is not speech and is beyond it. But did you notice what else came up as a complaint here? Being called a Nazi. Being silenced separate from the physical action. Both of these were done with speech, and had it not escalated to forcing him away, we would have a case of whose speech do we defend? The speech of the obnoxious people insulting him and cutting him off, or the speech of the person politely holding a sign supporting free speech? I'd certainly be more in favor of the polite guy, even if they'd never gone beyond mere words. I don't like the way those other people were behaving at all. But a consistent, absolutist view of free speech applied to that situation prior the force would necessitate defending their right to call him a Nazi and to say they don't care what he has to say instead of hearing him out. And in a legal sense, I would. I don't think they should be arrested for it, fined for it, etc. But I'd do so while also criticizing what they were doing there. And possibly while pointing out the absolute lack of evidence, in that video at least, that he was, in fact, a Nazi. When he gets back on track is where I honestly begin to get a bit irritated and eventually angry. Here.
Anyhow, to get back on track, here's the second reason that Angus gave.
When we're talking about free speech and protecting free speech, we need to be very, very clear on what we mean. Because Milo Yiannopoulos does not have a right to speak at the UC Berkeley campus, and I say that as a First Amendment absolutist. Richard Spencer does not have a First Amendment right to speak on any campus, and again, I say that as a First Amendment absolutist. The American campus is a place where it's a community and it's an institution. It is not a place where anybody has an equal right to speak.
So, first off,
so does Richard Spencer have a right to speak on college campuses? Turns out legally he does. Let's say that your college has a policy whereby, a public college has a policy whereby you can rent space. Then Richard Spencer has as much right to rent that space at a public college as anybody else does, and you can't bar him.
Now, let's look at a little bit more of what the original argument said.
When we're talking about free speech and protecting free speech, we need to be very, very clear on what we mean. Because Milo Yiannopoulos does not have a right to speak at the UC Berkeley campus, and I say that as a First Amendment absolutist. Richard Spencer does not have a First Amendment right to speak on any campus, and again, I say that as a First Amendment absolutist. The American campus is a place where it's a community and it's an institution. It is not a place where anybody has an equal right to speak. Fascists are like vampires. They can't come through the door unless you invite them in. They don't have a right to come onto your campus. This is why what Richard Spencer has done in the recent past is he has scoured the nation for campuses, public campuses, that have a policy that say that anybody may speak. That's not a First Amendment thing, that's a policy thing. They have decided to open their doors to anybody who wants to spend the money to rent a room. It's basically like renting a room at a Holiday Inn. And they do this to raise funds. I'll be done in a second. They do this to raise funds. They do it to be nice to people in the community who might not have a place for the knitting club to meet. And so what Richard Spencer does is he engages with this policy in a parasitical way. And what campuses are doing in many cases is they are changing that policy.
So, as you can see, the first thing Rationality Rules quoted here was already addressed to a degree before it was even stated in the original debate. What the response provided did was not only shift back away from the First Amendment, which is not the entirety of free speech discussions, but shift to how a combination of factors can result in a handful of places where literally anybody has the right to speak. That this has to be specifically a public campus, and that it only works while discussing spaces that are either rented out or freely accessible to anybody at all, should actually give us a hint as to what's going on here. This is supposedly a steel-manned version of the argument, and yet the underlying point that these platforms usually discussed are not a right protected by the First Amendment, contrary to the beliefs of some, seems to have been soundly missed.
And secondly, and more importantly, despite Angus saying that when we talk about free speech we have to be
very, very clear on what we mean.
He ironically didn't refer to free speech, he referred to the First Amendment, and they're actually not the same thing.
I agree, they're not the same thing. Though I would suspect that is actually an act of, in fact, being very, very clear about what was meant.
And what campuses are doing in many cases is they are changing that policy. Texas A&M did it. Richard Spencer wanted to come and they said, okay, well, we're going to close our open door policy. Nothing to do with the First Amendment. His First Amendment rights weren't violated there. But if you look at the media coverage and the public debate around all these fascists on campus, you will see it framed in a very unsophisticated way as if what were in play was the First Amendment, and that is very frequently not the case.
That may be showing a problem that one person wants to talk about the First Amendment specifically while another wants to talk about free speech more broadly. But I'm not sure it's ironic.
At the New York Law School, a couple of weeks ago, I was debating Angus Johnston, and he describes himself as a First Amendment absolutist. However, he supports the new forms of censorship on campus, like trigger warnings or shutting down meetings that are too extreme and so on. And as he said this, I thought, you know what, there actually isn't necessarily a contradiction between those two things, because you can support the restriction on any government intervention in censorship while also giving a green light towards the more informal censorship.
Good job! You figured out that one can be a First Amendment absolutist without also being a free speech absolutist when discussing things beyond the government. Way to go! Now I need to go back to something that was just said.
The new forms of censorship on campus, like trigger warnings.
I'm gonna have to call bullshit right here. Allow me to put two definitions up for you. This is what the word censorship means. And this is what the phrase trigger warning means. Guess what? They're not the fucking same. This is as bad as the misunderstandings surrounding safe spaces. This is up there with insisting on limitless freedom of speech for everyone, even the most vicious internet trolls, and then arguing that your freedom of speech is violated when you're called a racist or whatever. Way to butcher the language, people. For those who may be confused as to why I just lost it there, a trigger warning is actually an extension of the pre-existing content warnings that have long existed on various forms of media. The basic underlying idea is that some content, such as depictions or descriptions of rape, may cause certain people issues and, stemming from the medical use of the term, trigger symptoms of mental illness, such as PTSD or panic attacks. As with the safe spaces, the concept can be, and in some instances is, taken too far. Also, like with safe spaces, it has come to be a place where the people ridiculing it are talking about the excessive version, while the people supporting it are frequently not. But then there's this one potentially important detail about including a warning on your content, whether it's traditional media, a syllabus, online social media, whatever. It doesn't actually mean removing anything at all from the rest of the content. If I were to swear like a sailor in one video and I decided to put a warning at the beginning of it about obscene language because I think, rightly or wrongly, with or without good reason, that someone might come along and be harmed by it, or even if I do it merely because I think they might be offended. You know what I haven't done? Remove the fucking language this douche apparently thinks is being censored by that little bit of goddamn text I just displayed. I've only given you a heads up that it existed, allowing you something of a chance to make your decision to continue engaging in the content or not. And anything beyond that going on, including the alleged examples of people opting out of class content with no penalty because of those warnings, is actually a conversation of something beyond trigger warnings themselves. And this is only about halfway through Rationality Rules video. I've looked a bit further, and I know for a fact there's at least one more thing I'm going to have to address, but I need to cool down a bit first. Thanks for hearing me out. As always, civil discussion, suggestions, and constructive criticism are welcome in the comments or via social media. Feel free to rate, comment, and share. If you want to hear more from me, subscribe and click the bell for notifications, and check out the description for any sources that I've used.